Let's talk about Outer Dark. Outer Dark is so good. So good. Outer Dark is the second novel by Cormac McCarthy. Light years, millions of light years better than The Orchard Keeper by far. Outer Dark is so underrated, so good. You should check this one out. Out of his first three novels, Orchard Keeper, this one, and Child of God, this one beats the other two so far for me. Let's get into it. Outer Dark follows Kola and Renthi, who are siblings who have a baby, and Kola decides to leave the baby in the middle of the woods, and lo and behold, the baby gets taken by a traveling salesman called a tinker, and then you have the story of Outer Dark. So Cormac McCarthy apparently wrote this while he was going through a divorce, I've heard, and so a lot of these feelings, these anxieties of parenthood kind of creep up in here. I've heard that there's some, there's a lot of similar comparisons between this and David Lynch's Eraserhead, which if you haven't seen that, check it out. It's terrifying, a lot like this book. As soon as it starts, you have this brother and the sister who are living in an unspecified area of Appalachia. They live in this old abandoned house, and Kola and Renthi have a baby, their brother and sister, and it's pretty clear from the get-go that neither one of them really want this child. They're sort of stuck with it, and so Kola decides one day to pretend like he's going out, and he actually ends up leaving the baby in the middle of the woods. When he comes back, he tells Renthi, his sister, that the baby had died, and she doesn't really believe him. Renthi leaves to go find the tinker because she has a good feeling that the tinker took the baby, which he did. Early on in the novel, the tinker is roaming around with his goods, and he finds the baby in the middle of the woods, and he takes the baby. And it's not really clear what his intentions are, but I think it's implied that he plans on selling it or God knows what else. But Renthi goes on her path to follow the tinker, and Kola goes on his path to find Renthi. And so it's this kind of cat and mouse chase. But the writing is still, it's Cormac at his best. I feel like in this book, he's really cultivating his sound, his style, his cadence, his atmosphere. Outer Dark is so atmospheric. I feel like it along with Blood Meridian, The Crossing, is one of his most atmospheric books, and that really even hits home at the ending, which I'll talk about in a bit. But this whole book, you're just kind of trudging through the Appalachia with these characters, and everyone's kind of faceless, or if they do have faces, you kind of imagine their faces distorted. When I think of Southern Gothic fiction, Outer Dark by Cormac McCarthy feels like this could be the king of Southern Gothic fiction. You feel like you're reading a horror story that's just so happened to take place in the backwoods. Speaking of horror, there is an antagonist, well, three antagonists in this book, which actually, I would argue Kola is sort of an antagonist as well. But the three antagonists in this book are referred to as the Grim Triune, and they're sort of intercut throughout the story in italics of doing just acts of violence. And as the story goes on, you start to realize that they're following Kola. And so Kola meets these people along the way as he's looking for Renthi. Hold on one second. Kola is meeting people who may or may not help them. I notice most of the time that people aren't too keen on helping Kola. They're pretty antagonistic towards him. But for Renthi, it's a different story. People seem to take her in and want to help her, but she's just on the run. She's just looking for her baby, man. She does not want to stick around. But Kola, he meets these people. He gets in altercations. People are pretty skeptical of him. He keeps running into acts of crime. Like at one point in the novel, he runs into a pile of corpses. There was grave robbers who came and messed with these corpses, and people kind of start to think that Kola is the guy that did it, and so he just bolts. He doesn't even explain himself, he bolts. And that's kind of his whole thing in the story. He keeps getting wrongly accused of little things, and he bolts, but then you find out that the Grim Triune, who are these three nasty figures in the Appalachian woods who have a giant scythe, and you just imagine these cloaked, dark phantoms running around, killing all these people. Later on in the story, Cola finally meets the Grim Triune after a sort of ferry accident, and it's one of the most memorable scenes in any of Cormac McCarthy's books. You'd have to read it, but basically they're having a campfire, and Cormac describes everything as quieting down. You can't hear the birds. Everything just dulls down, and you can imagine yourself with this Grim Triune, and they're sitting around this fire, and they invite Cola to come rest by the fire a spell, and they give him a questionable piece of meat, and he's eating it, and it's kind of dark and black and chewy and doesn't have any discernible taste. And later on in the book, you kind of have an idea of what it might be. The Grim Triune is freaking scary, man. And the bearded one is the leader. I've heard many interpretations of the Grim Triune. I've heard people say that it's a product of Cola's mind, that he sort of imagines these three into being, and that they're sort of represent his whatever nastiness that's in his heart, that whatever sort of weird, I don't know, dreams that he might have, nightmares that he might have, or things that he wants to do violently to people, and he conjures up these nasty figures in his mind. But they could also just be freak shows. Either way, this Grim Triune is following Cola, and eventually all three of these plot lines, you got the Grim Triune, Cola, and Renthi, and the Tinker and the Child, all of them culminate at the end, and they come together, and it just all falls apart. The baby is found. Cola realizes that the Grim Triune has the baby, and the baby's all scarred, and it's older, and it's deformed, and it looks like an alien, and it reminds me so much of Eraserhead. Some of these anxieties that Cormac's going through in this story, but the child is just horrific. And then you start thinking, good gosh, what kind of meat were those guys feeding him? The Grim Triune, once they have the child and Cola is there, they basically devour the child. They completely devour it, and it is terrifying, and it is frightening, and it is disgusting, and it is Cormac McCarthy, people. Renthi, by the end of the novel, goes and finds this scene where this horrific feast took place, and she basically lies down, and that's the end of her character arc. I don't know if she dies, or if that's as far as Cormac will go. But she spends the whole novel looking for her child. She's so persistent. She keeps getting thwarted by obstacles, but she finally finds a spot, and I think she knows this is the spot where the child was killed, and she lies down, and her journey is over. And I think it really tackles an interesting questions about motherhood, which I can't speak to myself, but I think Cormac was really meditating on motherhood and what that means. And because at the beginning of the novel, Renthi does not want the child at all, but then something in her, some instinct in her, wants to at least see the child. No pun intended. She wants to see the child. She wants to know it. There's something in her that just feels drawn to the child, even though she didn't want it. It's a product of incest. You know, everything in the world would tell you that this child is not, a good addition to society, but she still persists and still wants to see the child. And Cola, on the other hand, doesn't. Let's get into Cola. Cola, I think, is one of the most unlikable Cormac McCarthy characters in his entire canon. I would put him up there with Lester Ballard as probably two of my least favorite characters that Cormac has created. Not that they're bad characters, they're just so impenetrable. Even Lester Ballard is easier to empathize with than Cola. As crazy as that sounds, Cola is just such a stubborn jerk, basically. He is set in his ways. He doesn't seem to have any motivation, any goal in this story. Mostly just running from something. And I think he wants to control the situation. He has a need to control the situations that he has no control over. He wants to control Renthi. He wants to control the whole situation. He's just not a likable character at all. I would put him down probably at the bottom of my list of Cormac McCarthy characters. I The cons are, it's hard to think of anything negative. I think the only negatives about this book is that it's not as good as other works of his, but it is still super, super good. Oh my gosh. It's a lot easier to follow than The Orchard Keeper. I think it's a lot better than Child of God, but I'll talk about that book in a different video. But let's talk about the ending of the story, because while the grim trying at the fire, devouring the child is really memorable, I think that the ending sentence of this book is one of his more memorable sentences, one of his more memorable endings. I think it's up there with the ending of Blood Meridian as far as something that really sticks in your mind. And I'll go ahead and read it here. The final paragraph. Going back the way by which he came, he met again the blind man tapping through the dusk. He waited very still by the side of the road, but the blind man passing turned his head and smiled upon him his blind smile. Holm watched him out of sight. He wondered where the blind man was going, and did he know how the road ended? So much to tell a blind man before setting him out that way. So it's a thought-provoking sentence. Basically, I feel like that, I mean, of course there's the imagery of it. I'm just thinking of this swamp, this rank, wet, hot, moist, gross, scary, frightening, infested, sick, disgusting. How many times have I said disgusting? Swamp. And you imagine Cola just kind of passing this blind man. This blind man's heading toward basically an end of the road, because Cola goes to the end of that road and it leads to a swamp, basically just water. The road ends and the blind man's going towards that direction, and he's not going to know, right? I mean, that's what the implication is. And it's just such a thought-provoking, interesting way to end this work. It's a get you thinking about how not all of us really are blind as far as our futures. We don't know what's ahead. Our road does have an end, we just don't know when it is. So in a sense, we are all this blind man at the end of this book. And another interesting thing is I feel like that ending sentence is sort of a thesis or a hypothesis of what he'll later explore and tear apart and rip into with the entire Border trilogy. The entire Border trilogy is really dead set on this theme. But anyway, Outer Dark, beautiful, awesome book, underrated as heck. It is such a good Cormac McCarthy book. I would recommend this out of his first 3 novels as his best. I feel like Outer Dark is an 8 out of 10. The only thing keeping it from getting any higher is that, man, there's some other of his books that just hit those points, and it's hard not to compare this to those, but this one's an 8 out of 10, y'all. It's a good one. Outer Dark is fantastic. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.